Hello and welcome back to Photoshop CS6 for web designers. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at the vector shape tools in Photoshop. And these shape tools allow us to draw shapes that can easily be manipulated using the direct selection tool. Now, if you're familiar with working in Illustrator, then this should all be pretty familiar to you because this is nothing more than drawing vector shapes and adjusting the anchor points and things like that. But it's pretty straightforward, so let's take a look at the rectangle tool. Now we've already used the rectangle tool a couple of times to just show a couple of examples, but the shape tools are located near the bottom of the toolbar, and if we click and hold down on one of the shape tools here, we can get the rest of the shape tools to pop up. So we have a rectangle tool, a rounded rectangle tool, which is just a rectangle with rounded corners, an ellipse tool for drawing ovals and circles, and a polygon tool for creating any shape that has 3 or more sides to it. And then we have a line tool and a custom shape tool. Now the options for these tools are all pretty much the same. We have the same fill and stroke options, and we can enter in our own width and height. We can do a number of different things for each of these different shapes. So we're going to start with just the rectangle tool. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the rectangle tool to draw the background shape for our content. Now, once we have the rectangle tool selected, you'll notice that our properties bar up here at the top changes, and we have numerous options to choose from. Now, the first option I want to talk about is this one right here, this little drop-down menu where we can choose shape, path, or pixels. The shape option creates a shape layer where you can then go in and change the options. We can change the dimensions of the object, we can change the shape color, the stroke color, we can even add gradients to our shape now in Photoshop CS6. But the shape option draws a vector shape and it keeps that path so that you can edit that path, but it also fills that path with whatever your fill color is, and it'll put an outline around it depending on whether you have a stroke color selected. Now the path option creates only the path itself. So it'll create a path representing a rectangle, but it won't be filled with any color. It won't have a fill or stroke applied to it. It'll just be the path itself. And there are a number of things you can do in Photoshop with a path. We're not going to really get into that in detail in this course. And then the last option is pixels. The pixels option creates the shape for us, but it's no longer editable as a vector shape. Now you can still go in with the selection tool and the transform tool and make some alterations to it, but you can't edit the vector shape itself. You no longer have access to the anchor points for the vector shape. So we're going to stay away from the pixels option and we're going to stick with shape. Once that's selected, we have an option to choose our fill color, which we've talked about briefly before. We can either choose one of the swatches that we have here, or we can click in the color picker to choose a custom color. Also, once you have this color picker open, you can use your eyedropper to click on any area of your Photoshop file and select that color for your shape. So if there's a color you've already used before that you want to use for your rectangle shape, you can select that using the eyedropper tool here. And once you have the color you want, you just click on the OK button, and that color is now selected for your fill color. So you can click in that thumbnail again to close your fill color options, and then we can choose your stroke color. So you can choose this color the same way as your fill color. You can either choose a swatch or use your color picker here to choose a different color and click on OK, and there we go. So then we have some options for the stroke. First of all is the thickness of the stroke. It's set to 1 point by default. We can change that by dragging this slider here, making it as thick or as small as we want. Or we can enter in our value like so. Our next option is new to CS6, and that's the option to create not only a solid stroke, but a dashed or a dotted stroke. These are very exciting new features for Photoshop CS6. People who have been using Photoshop for a while have been waiting for this forever. It's been around forever in Illustrator and in other software like that, but it's brand new to Photoshop CS6. Now we can actually create dashed and dotted lines, and if we go down to more options, we can even specify what we want the dashes and dots to look like. How wide do we want the dashes to be, and how wide do we want the gaps between the dashes to be? So there's a lot of new options in Photoshop CS6. that allow us to create some more custom shapes. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel and minimize that. We can also enter in a specific width and height for our rectangle if we want to. If we already know exactly how big something needs to be, then we can just enter in those values here and that will take care of it. But one option I really want to point out when we're talking about web design is this last little checkbox here called Align Edges. By checking Align Edges here, this will snap our pixels to the pixel grid. In other words, when we're clicking and dragging out and drawing a rectangle, we don't want this rectangle to end up in between pixels, because that creates some anti-aliasing issues sometimes and it doesn't look too great. But if we turn on Align Edges here, then it will snap everything to the pixel grid. So the left edge of your rectangle will be right on, I don't know, pixel number 20, and the right edge will be right on pixel number 120. It won't be 120.5. So that will allow us to keep our shapes nice and crisp, and everything will work out a little bit better if we keep this Align Edges turned on. So just leave that on at all times, especially when you're dealing with web design. So now that we've seen those options, let's jump into our file, Fred's Photo 003, and let's create our first rectangle. And again, this rectangle is going to be the background for all of our content. So we want it to take up pretty much most of the stage. We've already drawn our guides for the left and right edges of our content, and I want this content area to be about 110 pixels from the top edge of the stage. So I'm going to put another guide on the stage at a Y coordinate of about 110. So I'm going to go to the View menu, click on New Guide. It's going to be a horizontal guide, and for the position, I'm going to type in 110 and click on OK. And so that gives us a little bit of space up at the top where we can put our logo, and then just below the logo we'll put our content background. So I'm going to choose the rectangle tool. For the fill color, I'm going to choose white. And on the first row down here, not the recently used colors row, but the first row beneath that, we have a series of shades of gray, and this one on the far left is white, so I'm going to click on that to select white for the fill color, and then we'll minimize that, and I'm going to turn off the stroke. I don't want a stroke around the edges of this. So I'm going to click on the stroke thumbnail, and then this icon on the far left with a red line through it, that indicates that we don't want a stroke. So I'm going to click on that to turn the stroke off, and then we'll draw our shape. Now again, we want to make sure that we have snapping turned on so that when we start drawing the shape, it will snap to the guides we've already created. So I'm going to click on the View menu, make sure that snapping is turned on, and also go to Snap To and make sure that guides are turned on. And everything looks good, so we'll move forward. So I'm going to click on this upper left intersection of guides here and drag down and to the right. And I want it to go almost all the way to the bottom of the stage, and I want to make sure that it snaps to the right guide. And that looks pretty good. So we'll release, and we've created our first vector shape. Now keep in mind that when you create that shape, we see this dark black border around it, and that border is not actually part of our shape. That's just showing us where our shape is. That's the vector path for our shape. That dark border is not going to actually show up. If we hit V to switch to the Move tool, or we could just click up here at the top of our toolbar to click on the Move tool there, we can see that that border disappears. That border is only there to denote the actual vector shape that we've drawn. Now before we move on to the next video, I want to put a drop shadow behind our shape. I'm going to hit Command H or Control H on a PC to make our guides invisible so that we can just see our content on the stage. And if we jump into our original file, we can see that there's a slight shadow around the edges. And that's what we want to do now. And I'm going to do that using layer styles. And we've taken a very brief look at layer styles before, and we're going to do that again right here. So we have our rectangle layer selected. Let's go ahead and rename that layer. I'm going to double click on the layer name where it says rectangle 1, and I'm going to call it, actually let's erase that. Let's call it Content BG for content background. And then there are two ways we can open up our layer styles. We can either go to layer, layer style, and then choose which layer style we want, or the way that I usually do it is I'll come over here to the layer itself, and there are a couple different parts of this layer that we can click on. The first part is the thumbnail or preview section of that layer, and that's this white rectangle here. That kind of shows us a thumbnail of what the content of that layer looks like. After that is the name of the layer itself, and then we have this empty area to the right of the name. Well, if we double click in that empty area to the right of the name, that will open up our layer styles dialog, and we can go from there. So I want to put a drop shadow behind this. So if we click on drop shadow, notice I'm clicking on the word drop shadow, not just the checkbox. If I just click on the checkbox, it will apply the drop shadow with its default settings, but it won't give us any settings that we can customize. So instead of just clicking on the checkbox, I'm going to click on the word drop shadow, and that will check the checkbox, but it will also give us all of the customized options that we need in order to make this look like what we want it to look like. Now by default, this drop shadow has a little bit of a distance applied to it, a distance of 5 pixels, which basically puts it down and to the right of the shape itself. So we can't see any of that shadow above the shape or to the left of the shape. And I want to actually bring that distance down to 0 so that we can see that shadow on all 4 sides, top, bottom, left, and right. For this particular shadow, I also don't want it to stand out that much. We've got a nice bold black shadow behind it. I want to actually bring the boldness of that down a little bit, and I'm going to do that by adjusting the opacity of that shadow. So I'm going to click on the opacity slider and drag it to the left so that it's a very subtle effect. It just helps that content background stand out just a little bit. And bringing it down to about 33% actually works pretty well. You can also play with the spread and the size just to see what those options do. I'm going to leave those at the default and click on OK. And now we've applied a drop shadow to our shape. So those are some of the basics of working with vector shapes. If you ever want to go in and change the color of a vector shape, if you're changing the fill color, there's actually 2 ways to do it. One way we can do it is hit A, and that will switch us to the direct selection tool, which is also found towards the bottom of the toolbar here. We have a path selection and a direct selection tool. The direct selection tool, if we select that, you'll see that we get our vector options again up here at the top, and we can change our fill and stroke colors from that dropdown. The second way we can change the fill color is if we come over to our layers panel and double click in this thumbnail area, it will also give us a color picker, that we can use to change the color of our shape. Now I don't want to change that color, so I'm going to click on cancel. But anytime you want to make changes to the shape itself or to the color within the shape, the best way to do that is to go to the direct selection tool, and then you can make your changes accordingly. Another new feature of Photoshop CS6 that you might have noticed while we were drawing the shape is that if we start over again and draw another rectangle here, you'll see that we get this visual feedback on the width and height of our shape as we're drawing it out. Right next to our mouse cursor, we can see the width and height, and we can tell exactly how big our circle is, or our vector shape, whatever that vector shape is. We can see how large it is. So if we're going for a specific width and height, we can take a look at that and keep adjusting it until we get the width and height that we're going for. Obviously, we don't want another shape here, so I'm just going to hit delete to get rid of that. And let's save our file. So we're going to go to File, Save As. I'm going to save this as Fred's Photos 004.psd. And with that saved, we'll move on with the next video. Thank you for watching.